Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. My name is Eliane Schmid, and I will be hosting today's conversation on what may be called an early example of intercultural philosophy. Talking to me today about Confucius and his ties to Stoicism is Associate Professor of Humanities, Andrew Hui. Andrew currently works at Yale NUS College, Singapore, and specializes in early modern studies, with a focus also on the global Renaissance. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me for this Wisdom Talk.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Also in the studio with us is Metis founder and professor for philosophy, Michael Hampe. Welcome.
Hello, Eliane.
So in the Metis project, we try to bring philosophical traditions and voices of the world into contact with one another. Intercultural exchanges have a long history and date back substantially further than our Metis endeavor. Now you, Andrew, are working on a project carrying the title Confucius the Stoic, the encounter between Western and Chinese philosophy in the Age of Matteo Ricci. This title suggests that you can help us shed light on very early forms of intercultural wisdom exchange, and I would very much like to know more about this. For I must say, having gone to a high school that used to be a Jesuit college, I would not have associated Jesuits with any form of intercultural dialogue and rather just thought of them as strict, pious monks. But these are very much the thoughts of a 16-year-old hurrying past eerie paintings of former headmasters in the school corridors or the large statue of Petrus Canisius in the schoolyard. However, the Jesuit Matteo Ricci, who appears in the title of your project, seems to be a figure from whose life and work we can learn a lot. Could you, to begin with, explain who Matteo Ricci was and the circumstances of his travels to and through China?
Sure. Matteo Ricci was an Italian-born Jesuit priest. And what's interesting about the Jesuit order is that are a religious order, but they didn't belong in the monastery or the cloisters. They were founded specifically to be evangelists, and they were in the Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. Their mandate, their mission was really to both defend and propagate Christianity as a faith. So they really saw themselves as soldiers of Christ. Ignatius of Loyola himself used to be a soldier before he fell into battle, and he had this conversion moment when he was in convalescence in a hospital. The Jesuit order was founded in the early part of the 16th century, and by the second part of the 16th century, they were sending missionaries abroad. And Matteo Ricci happened just to be one of them. He was born in Macerata, and he went to China in the 1580s, and he stayed there until his death in 1620s. And Matteo Ricci, for me, is immensely interesting because he was one of the first Europeans to learn Chinese and to write in Chinese. And what interests me about his project is how Matteo Ricci and his other brothers saw that the way to evangelize to the Chinese was first to learn classical Chinese extremely well, to write in classical Chinese, and to translate Western classics into Chinese, and conversely, translate the Chinese Confucian classics into Latin. So I'm really interested in this, what we're calling intercultural exchange that is also linguistic, social, and religious.
And maybe a simple question, but how did they go about learning Chinese? Because even nowadays it's super difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And so imagine what it would be like for people in the 16th century. They learned Chinese like all of us by memorizing characters, by having immersion classes, and by hiring Chinese tutor. Of course, it helped that they were in China, and so it was a full-on immersion experience, and they were quite diligent about it. And in some of the letters, they document of studying 5-6 hours a day and how it was enormously difficult for them to learn the tones and the characters of the Chinese language.
It sounds as if the Jesuit order was very open to foreign cultures. It sounds as if to evangelize another culture did not mean that you just bring Christianity to the other culture, but that you absorb the other culture as well. Was there any methodology behind that? Did the Jesuit order think about how should we deal with the Chinese? How much of their knowledge and beliefs should we accept or translate in our beliefs? Or was it just up to the individuals who traveled to China, how they deal with the new or foreign culture?
Yeah, I think the way we can answer this question is several ways. One is to look at Jesuit formation. And Jesuit formation meant that someone who wanted to join the order had to spend several years studying. And first, what did they study? They spent 2 years at what is called the Collegio Romano in Rome. And for the first 2 years, they learned Latin and Greek and also classical philosophy. And then after that, they learned theology. And it wasn't until their final years of study that they learned really biblical studies, right? So a good basis of their knowledge was familiarity and mastery of the text and the ideas of the philosophies of Plato and the other ancient philosophers. Now, this is important because they use this as their foundation for basically all of their epistemologies. And when the Jesuits went to China, they sought to find equivalences, right? And so this was their bridge to understand the other culture. And so in that sense, yes, the Jesuits were enormously open and receptive to ancient Chinese culture. And so you might call this, in the history of ideas, the first encounter of China in the 16th century was one of Sinophilia. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really until later on in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment that there was what you might want to call Sinophobia, mm-hmm. right? And so the image of China changes, right? From Confucius, the founder of Chinese thought, the sage, one of the wise men of the East, to the image of China as, the lazy man of the East and the empire that never changes and that's completely backwards and so forth. And so, yes, the Jesuits were enormously interested in Chinese cultures because they wanted to see whether in early Confucian thought there were seeds or intimations of divinity.
So they wanted to learn about these things to enhance their own Christian studies, or just out of curiosity? Did they aim to combine the different theories?
I think it was both. And I wouldn't say they wanted to combine both Chinese and Christian thought as much as to see in ancient Stoicism and in ancient Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism these points of similarities, these in which Stoicism and Confucianism would serve as the foundation in which they could build the edifice of Christianity.
And would they then bring that knowledge back home to Europe again in that case and then spread it to build that foundation? Yeah,
so there was this one particular letter that Matteo Ricci writes to his superior general back in Rome. And his superior general, his name is Claudio Acquaviva. And very interestingly, Matteo Ricci tells him, what they've been doing. And he says, every day we study Chinese. And for the whole year, we've been translating these works of the Chinese tradition. And he says in morals and also in their literary form, they're very much like Seneca. And so this for me was a moment of both insight as well as cognitive dissonance. And so this was really what launched my project. And so what the Jesuits did eventually, including Matteo Ricci, was to translate Aristotle's works, Euclid's geometry, lots of cartographic writings, as well as the maxims of Epictetus into Chinese. And then at the same time, they also translated the Confucian classics into Latin. And so they were really the main brokers between the two cultures. And it's amazing to imagine how these two vast cultural ensembles that had very little contact with each other was really only brokered by no more than 1 or 2 dozen men who happened to be religious.
But didn't they not only have to deal with the differences between Chinese culture and European culture, but also with the differences between, let's say, moralistic wisdom literature, if you want to call the sayings of Epictetus that way, religious texts, and let's say cosmological texts, because part of the Stoic tradition, perhaps you can a little bit talk about that as well, is related to the cosmos as a whole and how we as humans should relate to the cosmos. And you could say that that is perhaps cosmology, perhaps religion, perhaps philosophy. And how do these things work in Confucianism? Is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? Is it a moral wisdom? And how do both of these relate to Christianity, where you have a created world, where you have Jesus preaching morals from the mountain? So it seems to be very complicated to relate all these different types of texts and belief systems to each other.
Yeah, it is very complicated. And the fascinating thing was really the vast imagination and the intellectual enterprise that the Jesuits were engaged in trying to find equivalences and the compatibility. And this is what scholars call the accommodationist theory of the Jesuits. Now, in order to explain this set of questions that you've posed, it's helpful to think of this term that's found in the classical tradition, which is called logos spermatikos. And what logos spermatikos means, it's really the seeds of logos, the seeds of discourse in which the Christians believe that the pagan philosophers of old, right, and people in different cultures all have this innate intuition of the divine, right? And as you know, Aristotle in the first sentence of the Metaphysics says, all men by nature desire to know. And so the point I'm driving at is that they saw that both the Chinese and the ancient Stoics had this logos spermatikos. And so we can use this, right, in order for them to understand finally Christian salvation, in the sense that the ethics found in Stoicism, what reason is and how we deal with suffering in times of vicissitudes, and the Confucian search of goodness, what proper behavior is, right, were good things, good foundations in which then you could import, as it were, the Christian faith.
Yeah, I understand that for the relation between, say, Christianity and Stoicism, you might say that the logos in the Stoics is something divine, and there is a bit of God in each human being by having a spark of this logos. And then the beginning of the Gospel of John has logos, that there was logos in the beginning. So there is an overlap in terms between a religious text and, say, a philosophical text. But what was the Chinese term in Confucianism that corresponds to logos? And what is the meaning of the corresponding Chinese term, if there is one term?
Yeah, I think for logos, I would say it's Tao, right? And Tao. This is the same Tao as the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu. But I think we can approach this question using another term, which is Tian. And what Tian means, it is heaven, it's the sky, and it's that which is above us. And the ancient Chinese term for the god of heavens is Tianzhu, and another term is Shangdi. And so Matteo Ricci was immensely interested in these two terms of Shangdi and Tianzhu. In fact, Tianzhu in modern Chinese today, Tianzhu Jiao means Catholic, right? And Tianzhu is the Lord of the heavens, and Shangdi is also this venerated ancestors from above. And so what Matteo Ricci tried to do is to reach back into the earliest classical Chinese text and to find these equivalences. And he found in these two concepts the intimations of a metaphysics, of a cosmology.
Now, you talked a lot about the different education the Jesuits had before they actually went to China and learned all these things. But I would still like to ask a bit more about that. So what was maybe Ricci's cultural and educational background, and what did he encounter when he went to China? Or to put it another way, and for lack of a better word, what kind of traditions clashed here?
Yeah, so Matteo Ricci was born in Macerata, which is on the eastern coast of Italy. And in his early 20s, he went to Rome to receive his training as a Jesuit. And so he spent some time in the Collegio Romano. And this was also really a hotbed for humanist activities. In humanist activities, they were translating and learning the Greco-Roman classics, and they were developing their humanistic theology. Then all Jesuits who went east, they would actually start off in Goa, India. So he spent some time in Goa, India, and then he made his way to Macau and along the eastern seaboard of China, and finally went all the way to Beijing, and that's where he died. And while he was there, he rented houses with his Jesuit brothers, and they tried to make relationship with the Mandarin, the elites of the court. And when they entered in China, they were debating between two strategies. One, whether you should evangelize to the masses, the common people, or whether you should get to the top first, right, to the elite Mandarins, and then you would have this kind of trickle-down conversion. They, interestingly, chose the second half. And while they were trying to figure all of this out, for a while, they were actually dressed as Buddhist monks. And they actually saw the Buddhist sect as their competition, right? And so very quickly, they actually said lots of bad things. They really badmouthed the Buddhist. And then but they really liked the Confucians, and they even dressed like the typical garb of the Confucian official.
I find this super interesting that they really immersed themselves or really went full on in that journey. Mm-hmm. And also that Matteo Ricci actually died in China. So he never physically went back to Europe to tell mm-hmm. the others what he learned. So everything was just via letters.
Yeah, because the travel was just to be enormously arduous and long, as you can imagine.
So, but he knew from the beginning that he would start this travel and never go back to Europe, or did he think he would do a round tour?
That's a good question. And I think when you join the Jesuit order, you have to have complete submission to not only God, but to your superiors, right? So that is the process of your renunciation, that you leave home, right? You give up and forsake everything that you have, right, for the greater glory of God. And there were actually lots of young men who were interested in this journey. And if you wanted to become a Jesuit, it's this very long spiritual process of examination. You have to take a lot of exams, and there would be lots of inquiries. And many of them didn't make it, right? They weren't accepted. And in the archives of Rome today, we have lots of these files in which the Jesuits compiled on each candidate. And so you have to take a pretty rigorous exam even to get admitted into the Jesuit order. And some of it would really to test, right, the compatibility you have to undertake this really life-changing journey.
You just said that the Jesuits considered the Buddhists as competitors. And I wonder when this happened. Did they have a picture of the intellectual landscape in China already? Did they know that there is Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism all playing a role in China? Or did they learn about this landscape when they were there and then detected, the Buddhists are important and might be our competitors? So was it learning by doing, or did they have, say, a preparation for what was going on in China, in Rome already?
Yeah, it was certainly learning by doing. They didn't have a Lonely Planet guide to 16th century China. There was no Wikipedia or analog. Here's a cheat sheet on what contemporary Chinese culture was like. And so when they entered, they were strangers in a strange land, and they had to figure out all of this very quickly. But they made friends quite rapidly, and there were certainly Chinese intellectuals who were interested in them. And it was in China, by learning Chinese, that they figured out that there were, even within Confucianism, there were different camps and there were different academies. And late 16th century China was also an immensely exciting intellectual time in China, in which Confucianism was being re-examined, and there were new intellectual movements that emerged in this time.
Now, I'm wondering, because you said the Jesuits were very much interested in what they encountered there. They even changed their clothes, which I wonder was that the kind of liberation for them from changing from their normal Jesuit garbs? But another question that I also have is, was the interest reciprocal? Were they well received? You said they made friends quickly, but I'm still wondering, were they received with open arms, or was it a bit difficult in the beginning nonetheless?
One of Matteo Ricci's most interesting works is this collection of maxims or aphorisms called 交流论, which is maxims on friendship, right? And so not only did they practice the ethics of friendship, they really made a philosophy out of it. And what Matteo Ricci does in this anthology of maxims, there are 100 of them, is that he picks these choice quotations from classical Western antiquity on friendship, as well as different theories and a bon mot of friendship in the Confucian tradition, in order to find this equivalence. So unlike other Catholic missionaries, for example, in the New World, in which the Dominicans, Franciscans went to the New World accompanied by the conquistadors, by an army and a navy, they went there unarmed. And so they had to use a different strategy. And so theirs was much more welcoming, much more about creating communities than, for example, in the New World, where really, for all we know, there were lots of forced conversions and military conquest.
And with that strategy, were they actually successful in disseminating Jesuit thoughts?
So everyone would have to admit that there were no mass conversions, right? In Latin America today, most people are Catholics, right? And in the Philippines today, and the Philippines are named in honor of Philip II, the Habsburg monarch. The Catholics had a huge presence there, and they really colonized the Philippines. The Westerners did not really colonize as such China. And so in terms of quantitative impact, it was really a drop in the bucket. Right? We can count on the number of our hands the converts to Christianity. And later on, both in China and in Japan, the Jesuit orders were suppressed because there were what you might want to call intramural rivalry between the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And the Franciscans, Dominicans didn't like the Jesuits, and then they told the Pope in Rome what the Jesuits were doing in China was wrong. And so the Pope forbade them, and they were recalled to Rome. And then the last Ming emperor kicked them out. But then in the Qing dynasty, with Kangxi, they were invited back again. So it was a bit of a complicated history. So it was quite mixed.
I know that you worked already also on the interest people like Leibniz and Wolff had in Chinese culture, Chinese philosophy. So would you say that the impact China had on Europe via the Jesuits was stronger than the impact Catholicism had on China via the Jesuits, so that the Jesuits were more or less channeling Chinese wisdom into Europe and not Christianity into China?
I think it was both. And I think we can kind of separate, of course, Christianity is often conflated with Europe, and Europe is often conflated with the West. And then there's, Christianity and Catholicism, and then later on with Protestantism. One of my larger project is to investigate this contrapuntal history of China in the West and the West in China. You can see the influence of Chinese culture and society in early modern Europe everywhere, from the taste in tea to this obsession with ceramics, right? Like porcelain was a highly coveted commodity, spices, silk, right? To the very rarefied intellectual world, which, as you mentioned, Leibniz and his disciple Christian Wolff, they were immensely interested in Chinese thinking. And their sources of Chinese thought were the French Jesuits. Louis XIV, Louis XIV, the Sun King, actually sent from Versailles five Jesuit mathematicians to Kangxi Emperor because he saw both of them as kind of colleagues in these Euro-Asian monarchies, right? And he really admired Kangxi the Emperor, and he wrote letters to them and sent gifts to them. But my particular interest is actually with Leibniz. Leibniz, as we know, is the founder of modern calculus. And there is this little historiographical controversy of who invented calculus, whether it was Isaac Newton or Leibniz. And interesting thing is that Chinese thinking is involved in this debate because as Leibniz was developing his ideas of binary computational thinking, he got wind of this ancient Chinese text called the I Ching, which is the Book of Changes. And the Book of Changes is a divinatory manual. It's a book for divinations, and you have these things called the hexagrams. And each figure of the hexagram is 6 lines in which they could be a continuous line or a broken line. Now, what Leibniz, in his capacious imagination, did was see a precursor to his own combinatory binary thinking in the I Ching. And so I'm interested in these moments in the history of ideas in which great thinkers like Leibniz found patterns in Chinese thought.
So you think that Leibniz saw that the alternative between closed line and a broken line is a binary code, and that the Chinese had already a similar idea that he wanted to develop. Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things we have to ask Leibniz is was this kind of a universal thinking in which he discovered, or this is something that he invented and the Chinese only had prefigurations of it? Now, what's interesting is that these very learned men from Matteo Ricci to Leibniz and Christian Wolff would actually, in their presumptuousness, or maybe you might even want to say arrogance, would correct current interpretations of the native Chinese commentaries on Confucius and says, oh, actually, you don't really understand the true meaning of Confucius. I've got it, right? And so this was kind of part of their grand discourse.
Did it go the other way as well? Did Confucians actually start correcting the Jesuits as well?
I think from what we know, the Chinese were much less interested in Western philosophy. What the imperial court in the late Ming and Qing dynasty were immensely interested in was actually Western science. And at a certain point in the court of Kangxi, Jesuits became the official imperial astronomers. And astronomy in this time was immensely important, and the Bureau of Astronomy was a department in the larger bureaucracy of rites. And what we mean by rites is rituals. As you might know, for the Chinese, ritual and proper ceremony, the proper conduct in sacrifice and ritual was immensely important. And the emperor, as the son of heaven, determines the calendar, right? When there is a new dynasty, when there's a new emperor, the year will start afresh. This is year XYZ of the reign of Emperor XYZ, right? And they were interested in the Western knowledge of the calendar because the calendar would determine the time of year in which you would plant seeds and the time in which you would have harvest. And this was enormously important because agriculture was the very foundation of political legitimacy.
Perhaps you can say a little bit more about what ritual means in this context, because to me, in the West, let's say, ritual sacrifices have a magical air, that you believe that you have some connection to the supernatural by conducting a ritual. But it seems to me that you are pointing to a relation between ritual and science, that you need astronomical science in order to govern agriculture. But what I've heard is that to become a person who is good in conducting a ritual is also an ethical goal. So it seems as if the ritual is connecting science and ethics and politics in a very complicated way. Perhaps you can a little bit tell about these complications.
Sure. Ritual performance is fundamental to Confucian doctrine. And what that means is that the proper conduct in any ritual, whether it be micro encounters, as we are having a conversation right now, we're in a studio, and there is this implicit code of conduct, right, that I'm speaking and nobody's really interrupting, and when you ask a question, I'm intently listening to it and trying to my best efforts, answer it, right?
So you're saying we are following a ritual now as well?
Yeah, in a way, an implicit ritual, right? Now, how this relates to Confucian rule is that what ritual does is that it is trying to bring a harmony, an accord between the individual and all aspects of society, and by extension, the cosmos itself. This is why Confucian thought is extremely hierarchical. It's all based on this complex matrix of relationships. And in Confucian thought, there are 5 relationships. One is the relationship between the minister and the ruler, between friends, between husband and wives, between children and their parents, and between the people and the state. What ritual does, whether it be this intellectual exchange we're having, or to something very large like the imperial sacrifice to the ancestors, right, would be governed by this code of ritual that is both implicit as well as explicit. And so the long and short of it is that proper ritual brings an accord and brings into harmony the individual and thereby extension the community, the state, and ultimately the cosmos, as well as where we are in the here and now and the world of our ancestors.
And the harmony is produced by following the rules very correctly, or is it produced by having a certain style in engaging in the ritual?
I think what happens is, well, Confucius says, I never create, I only transmit. And what is he transmitting? He is transmitting wisdom. And where is wisdom to be found? Wisdom is to be found in the sages. How do we get to thinking of the sages? We do that through the examination of the classics. And that one of them is indeed the Book of Changes. And there is also the Book of Poetry, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rituals, and Book of Histories.
So I'm wondering, now that you just mentioned these different books, and you talked a lot about the state and state governance, what about the common people, if I call them that, or just the entire rest? Were they included in these different rituals and these different ways of behaving with one another? And was there, as you also said in the beginning, was there finally this trickle-down effect?
Yeah, I think we all have to admit that when we read the Analects, all of Confucius's disciples are men, right? And when he talks about the ideal gentleman, it's the ideal man, not woman. And in fact, this is one of the main critiques of Confucianism, that it led to feudalism, it led to gender disparity, it led to you only have the aristocrats and the rest are these rural people who are suffering and have to toil. And so this was actually a huge critique of the communist in the first part of the 20th century, right? That Confucianism is really old-fashioned. In order to create a new China, we have to get rid of it. And what's interesting now is that in the past 20 years, as China is reemerging as a world power, there is this revival of Confucian thought.
And now that you just mentioned there's a revival of Confucian thought and how it is percepted today, maybe could you make a link for us to what this whole story that we're talking about now means for us today, both in China and maybe in Europe nowadays, where Ricci actually comes from?
I think the big story I'm trying to tell is what you've already intimated in the introduction, is how did people in the past understand different culture and different cultural differences? And what are the translation technique that we have to use to engage in intercultural understanding? For the Jesuits, they had, I wouldn't want to say ulterior motive, but they had an ultimate purpose, which was evangelization, right? They believed that Christianity was the way, the life, and the truth. In our secular age, what are we to do with this legacy? And this is where lots of political theorists and philosophers around the world have this newfound interest in Confucianism, because what Confucianism promises is this ethics without God, in a way. And in China itself, with this resurgence of nationalism and with its reemergence as a political and economic and geopolitical superpower, how do the Chinese people treat the past? And in the world today, just like there are lots of Goethe institutes around the world, there are lots of Confucius institutes around the world, and that lots of people are learning Chinese today, right? And particularly in Singapore, in the early 80s and 90s, Lee Kuan Yew, the founding prime minister of Singapore, he was immensely interested in Confucianism because Confucianism offered a modern, non-democratic way of good governance.
So if we take what we said just now, that the intellectual legacy can maybe also be translated as, and Confucianism as an ethics without God, then this seems to be, although there are its faults, as you also mentioned before, because that it's rather male-oriented, but I mean, we can change that luckily today. Would you say that this is maybe a useful starting point for, because we're living in a global world, for international conversations, if we take these theories that are not geared to one specific overarching creed or being? So do you think this would be a good starting point to start dialogues?
Yeah, and I think this is really the main point of the Metis project in terms of what are the wisdom traditions around the world and what continued relevance do they have for us. And of course, I think we should take a pluralistic approach, and Confucianism is one of many within China, within Asia, and in our world, because even within China itself, you have lots of contending schools, right? Let 100 schools contend, let 100 schools blossom, right? And there's Confucianism, there's Taoism, there is Maoism, there's Buddhism, right? And even within Confucianism, right, it's not a monolithic entity. There are lots of diversity and differences across the centuries and amongst intellectuals.
I like the connection that you made to our Metis endeavor. And so maybe as a final question to you both, do you think that from this story of Matteo Ricci, we can today reflect on how these Jesuits, which are loaded in with their whole background, but that we can take this group of people that joined other people in a very different part of the world, I mean, thinking in 16th century terms, to help us today be open-minded, as the Metis Project also wants, and again, have a dialogue with one another. Or what would you say we can take mostly from this story as a final thought?
What we just heard from Andrew sounds as if the Jesuits were sort of cultural ambassadors who were as much interested in their own tradition than they were in the traditions they traveled to. And if we would have such cultural ambassadors as well, not only in Goethe and Confucius institutes, but as individuals going around and being open to other cultures, that would be very helpful, I would think.
Yeah, I think people like Matteo Ricci or even Marco Polo are of immense interest to me, because if I can maybe reflect on my own identity for a moment. I am Asian American. I was born in London. I spent the first half of my childhood in Hong Kong. Then my parents immigrated to the US when I was 9. I got all of my higher education in America. But for the past 10 years, I have been teaching and professing European literature as an American-trained scholar in Asia, right? And so I think figures like Marco Polo and Matteo Ricci, for me, are inspiring to think of intercultural understanding, that we can go beyond our places of origin and beyond our upbringing and formation to see all the amazing things that are beyond our normal conceptions of heaven and earth.
This is a very beautiful finishing thought, and I'm very fascinated by your background and how you combine all this in your research now.
Right, and I'm also very interested in, I didn't go to a Jesuit high school, right? And of course, in America and worldwide, the reputation of the Catholic Church has been tarnished a bit by various scandals. And so Jesuits itself also has this immensely long 500 years history in which there are both lights as well as shadows, just like any human institutions. And I think it's important to recognize that in the early modern period, there were global Christian missions, not all of it for the good, right? The Pope just apologized just last year, the tremendous sufferings that the indigenous people did, right, had because of colonialism.
Yep, the topic of colonialism and how we're thinking about that today is definitely worth a further Metis podcast, I think, or a Metis wisdom talk, because there is a lot to rethink, I think, concerning that as well. So this also makes me happy. There's many, many more topics for wisdom talks, and hopefully we can continue this conversation another time again. But so at this point, I would very much like to thank you both for this inspiring conversation that gives us room.
Thank you so much for having me on the air.
Thank you, Alien.
So we have lots of topics for our continuing talks. And at this point, I would also like to invite our listeners, in that case, to follow further wisdom talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. If you would like to share your own wisdom thoughts on the Metis portal, we encourage you to do so. We have an open call for contributions and welcome your texts or creative contributions on any topic connected to wisdom that you would like to share with the Metis community. You can find more information about this and about today's podcast in the show notes below. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.